Before we dive into part 1 of a 2-part video on suspension, let me quickly thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is a community where millions of people come together to learn online, with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people to learn and develop skills across fields like illustration, photography, videography, design, and much more. There's classes for pure beginners and those for more experienced people looking for professional inspiration. If you want to get creative with your photography, as I love doing, but don't want to invest in anything beyond the phone in your hand, try Amelie Satska's Conceptual Photos on Your Phone class to wow, inspire and provoke you into doing some wild photo art. Skillshare is less than $10 a month with an annual subscription, but the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a completely free trial to explore all they have to offer. So get clicking to bag your free trial. Thanks Skillshare. Now, on with the video. Let's discuss an F1 car's suspension, why it's needed, what it does, and how it works. To do that, we'll need to go over the basics of suspension first, the fundamentals of what it's trying to achieve, and how that's designed into the tight body of an F1 car. That's what we'll be covering in this video. Then in a second video we'll go into more details and explain how and why an F1 car balances and tunes forces across the car with dampers and anti-roll systems and such. So let's start at the very beginning. The only thing connecting an F1 car to the track it's driving on are the wheels. So all the steering, braking, aero and power are all dependent on how those inputs are translated into forces through the tyres and into the track. Ideally we want tyres planted properly at all times, as squarely as possible with as much tread as possible meeting the tarmac. We want the right amount of weight distributed across the four wheels to meet the load demands of cornering, braking and acceleration while keeping the aerodynamic platform of the car relatively stable. A huge amount of this can be controlled and regulated by the suspension. Let's imagine a car where the wheel axles are fixed rigidly to the car chassis. The wheels are free to rotate obviously, but the axle and the car essentially move as one fixed unit. If the car is travelling along a smooth surface, all is perfectly fine. But if there are bumps in the track, the wheels will ride those bumps and be violently kicked up and down. As the car and axles are fixed together, the chassis itself will be kicked around exactly as violently as the wheels. The front and back end will just match the vertical trajectory of the wheels. You can also imagine how this could be more than just a little discomforting to the person inside, but also it puts a lot of force through the chassis, potentially causing damage. On top of that, with the car bouncing around a lot, reacting to those bumps, which you could imagine as a bumpy track or the brutal curbs around corners, will cause the tyres to load and unload as they leap from the track's surface. This reduces the handling of the car as you can't reliably input your steering, acceleration and braking through the tyres if they are not properly planted to the track. So instead, let's start by placing a spring between the wheel mounting and the chassis mounting. A spring is cool because it absorbs energy via compression. If you load a force along a spring, it steals the energy into changing the shape of the spring, converting it into potential energy. This is similar to elastic, which stores energy via extension. Springs store energy via compression. So the spring reduces the force going into the chassis by absorbing it into its compressed shape. So while the wheel may still be kicked forcefully upwards by a curb, the chassis now sees less of that upward energy, so reacts more mildly. But a spring, like elastic, desperately wants to return to its original shape. It will store the energy as long as it's held compressed, but when released, it will extend with some force. This can result in the car ending up bouncing wildly as the spring absorbs and then releases the compressed energy. This is also bad for handling and drivability, as the car is now unpredictably bouncing over the track after every bump. The problem is almost all the energy is still in the system, you're just releasing it into the car in a different way. What we need to do is actually get rid of this energy somehow before it gets to the chassis, and this is where we introduce dampers to dissipate the energy. We can add a shock absorber to the spring in the form of a hydraulic piston. So imagine the top and bottom mounts of the spring are now connected via a piston filled with a kind of oil. There are small holes in the piston itself and between the inner and outer chambers which allow a limited flow of fuel as the piston moves up and down. But this takes a lot of effort. You can imagine how hard it is to push and pull the piston through this fluid. So the energy in compressing and releasing the spring is being lost working this piston through the fluid, so we won't see a dramatic compression and extension badoing of the spring. And you can design and adjust dampers differently to change how easy it is to either compress or extend the spring. You might want an easier compression rate than relaxation rate, depending on your setup needs, for example. Shock absorbers are velocity sensitive, and this means that the faster you try and force them, the more they'll resist, which is incredibly useful for working a violent curb versus gentle compression of the car as it handles. So now the ride of the car is smoothed out, and this is especially important in a racing car for both handling and aero stabilisation. As the chassis and its components are fine-tuned aero surfaces, having the car move around in the airstream in a bouncy, chaotic way would undo a lot of the good work put into its aerodynamic design. So keeping the platform of the car as stable as possible maximises its aerodynamic efficiency. Okay, so all well and good so far, but you may be looking at this graphic and back at an F1 car and think, well, this looks nothing like F1 suspension. I've never seen a spring in my life, just a bunch of carbon fibre arms. And you'd be right. While there did indeed used to be traditional spring setups on an F1 car that looked quite similar to what you might see under your Peugeot 106, these have all been converted into tighter, well-packaged solutions inboard. So, coming off the front wheel mount, you'll see 6 arms joining it to the chassis. 4 of these are just the wishbones that essentially structurally connect the wheel to the car. 1 is the steering arm or track rod. This moves horizontally through the chassis and pushes and pulls the wheel mount around a pivot point supported by the wishbones. Lastly is the pushrod or pullrod, depending on your setup. Up front, basically everyone uses a pushrod system, so let's start there. The pushrod is connected to the wheel mount and enters the chassis through a hole and connects to a rocker, which is basically just a mounting allowed to rotate about an axis. As the wheel is raised relative to the chassis, the rod pushes the rocker, rotating it, hence the term push rod. The rod pushes against the rocker. The alternative solution, favoured at the rear of the car currently, involves mounting a rod and rocker such that the wheel rising will pull the rocker around its axis. This is a pull rod system. But we'll stick at the front with the push rod for now. So the benefit of this rocker is that it translates the linear motion, back and forth here, into a rotational motion. So now we can work the suspension in any direction we like off this rocker. Great for packaging. Our dampers can now slot in nicely here, for example. So the jolt of the wheel comes in this direction, but is damped in this direction through the rotation of the rocker. Also note that because we can mount different parts of the suspension at different distances from the pivot point, we can magnify the motion into the piston of the damper. By mounting the damper further from the pivot of the rocker than the pushrod, we can translate small motions in the pushrod into long motions in the damper, giving us greater fidelity in controlling the damper characteristics. Now the spring in the front suspension isn't a spring at all, but a torsion bar. A torsion bar is simply a metal rod made to particular material characteristics. One end is fixed rigidly to the rocker, so it turns with the rocker. The other end is fixed rigidly to the chassis, so it doesn't rotate at all. As the pushrod rotates the rocker, it forces the torsion bar to twist, something the torsion bar will resist. And when released, the torsion bar snaps back to its original shape. So functionally, it's identical to a spring in how it absorbs and releases energy, but is lighter, smaller, and more flexibly packaged. So this here is your very basic suspension setup so far. Hopefully you can see how F1 cars absorb and control forces from the wheel so as not to upset the car. But it of course gets more complicated than that, as teams will want to have greater control over the distribution of forces over the 4 wheels of the car to maximise the handling of the car. So in the next video we'll go deeper into systems like anti-roll bars, heave dampers, and systems that will help optimise the whole setup of the car.